Hello and welcome to the Rask Network. What you're about to hear and see is limited to general financial information only. Please be sure to speak to your financial planner or refer to our financial services guide available at rask.com.au/FSG before acting on the information.
Welcome back to another episode of the Australian Retirement Podcast. I'm here with James O'Reilly from Northeast Wealth.
Hey there, everyone.
Good to be here. Good to see you as always.
Yeah.
We're going into a really exciting topic today. Exciting as it can get when you're talking about retirement, but basically we're looking at how to build wealth in the lead up to retirement and the different strategies, structures and options you have in doing that. What we tend to see, and it can be the same in financial advice, is that people tend to go straight to the solution or what's the product, what fund, what structure, what am I looking for? But I think probably good to start this episode by thinking a step back. And we're not just talking about, so this episode is for people that are probably in the lead up to retirement, but there's a lot of information that will help people that are already in retirement as well. So probably the big question would be, how important is understanding your cash flow? And at what point do you start? For some reason I keep saying socking away money. I don't know if I put money in my socks or something like that, but at what point and what steps do you go through to get to that decision? And when should people start thinking about that?
Yeah, agreed. There's a reason why so many financial advisors just harp on and on and on about cash flow. And the reason is because it really is the foundation of the financial progress you're going to make in most cases.
If you're not saving money, you can't save it.
Yeah. Now, one of the beautiful things that happens as you move closer and closer to retirement is the value of making good investment decisions becomes so significant. Yeah. The difference might be an extra couple of percent in your investments. Well, if you're 30 years old, your overall investment base, including super, might only be $50,000. But as a 60-year-old, it could be $500,000.
Yeah.
And then 2% is really meaningful. But especially when you're building wealth into the lead up to retirement and when you're in the earlier phase, the number one way that you can move the needle on your own finances is to have a cash flow surplus and to understand your finances well.
They require discipline?
Yeah, a lot of discipline. Yeah, or at least knowing your numbers and knowing what that's going to mean, and that's going to be pointing you in the right direction. You
got a better word than socking it away.
Yeah, do I know if I do?
Tell us how you describe it.
No, actually, I'm pretty happy with. Yeah. No, I'm happy with socking. It's good. No, there's something very
you
abrupt
had
about it.
Forging.
Sock it.
Forging. It sounds more disciplined and
no. Sock. It's
more suitable to a financial advisor.
I reckon when we're forging a cash flow surplus, one of the good things that should be happening to your finances as you move toward retirement is hopefully your expenses are actually reducing. Now, everyone's circumstances are different, but for, dare I say it, most Australians that are approaching retirement, the costs, a significant change in cost will be that your kids will grow up and hopefully fly the coop. So that grocery bill is going to go down. The electricity bill is going to go down. If you are also incurring costs around private school fees or supporting kids at uni or any of those costs too are going to go down.
Public school is expensive too.
Oh, you can't avoid it. Yeah, although it is pretty amazing value. Public school. So being aware of that cash flow surplus and how that's going to change. You might be listening to this as someone in their, for example, early 50s, and you really don't have a surplus at all between your mortgage repayments plus all the other costs that you have. But I think hopefully if you think about over the coming decade, the way that your cash flow is going to evolve, a combination of your salary continuing to grow as your role evolves, plus also not having mortgage repayments, hopefully, and not having education expenses and so on, that will enable you to have more free cash flow. And then we get to that layer of saying, right, well, we've got it. Where's it going to go? And
that's, people kind of forget about that. These are non-discretionary expenses. Yeah, you can probably choose to sell your house, but your mortgage, your education, they're not things you can control. Like they're essentially out of your control for a long period of time. And when those non-discretionary expenses start to reduce, well, my reaction would be, let's increase the discretionary and start spending a bit more. But at very much, and this is where good timing for advice is, you've got this significant change in cash flow. It might only last 10 years. And we see people where, 60% of the wealth that they've that they've saved at the point of retirement was actually done in the last 5 or 6 years before they retire. And that's when naturally the biggest questions come. So you've asked it, which is you've got this savings capacity. You're going to be putting away money monthly, quarterly, whatever it happens to be. Where do we go next?
Yeah. Also to add to that before we move on, that idea of timing, for example, all right, I've just paid off the mortgage, or I've just paid my final VCE school fee at whichever college, and we've now got this money available. Behaviorally, human beings are not good at reversing what we have. We're not good at turning that off. And why that's important is because if you are of the view that, look, I might actually, I think we would enjoy as a family or individually just a period of 6 or 12 months of just enjoying this fresh cash flow. And the problem is that it's actually quite hard to unwind. Once that lifestyle change gets embedded, having it pulled away is incredibly difficult. So there really is a lot to be said for proactively doing this. If you had $3,000 free a month, if you got used to spending that $3,000 and then an advisor said, hey, you're going to have so much better retirement, better outcomes if I take $2,000 of that away, you'd hate it. If you started at the beginning and someone said, hey, you keep one and we'll invest two, you'd probably be over the moon about that outcome. So do it early. So
you go.
So with response to where should it be directed,
couple of big options.
We've got some main ones, especially with the lens of looking to retirement. The obvious one in our previous episode, we're talking about the value of superannuation and talking about the way that in almost all cases that really will be foundational to you building your wealth for retirement. I think today this is a good opportunity for us to perhaps get a little bit more granular about why. Like, what are the real advantages of super, and why do so many advisors say this is the place for your money as a pre-retiree?
And it can be so confusing. Like, literally, the question, what is super? It's actually hard to. It's a vibe. It's not a vibe.
It's marbo.
but basically, it's a wrapper through which you can put your savings. It's no different to having, but even a trust is a foreign for a lot of people, I'm sure, as well. So having it's a structure through which you can invest for your retirement. And in Australia, it's incentivized to the point that it is by far the best structure to put your retirement assets, with the only drawback being that you can't access it until you're 60.
Yeah. And that's the trade-off, right? That's why the government has these incredible tax incentives for super, because people don't like putting money away and saying, I can't touch it for, let's say, a decade or however long. So the attraction is that you get these great benefits.
We're quite unique, and we're forced to save 11.5% at the time of recording. It'll be up. I'm sure it goes up pretty soon again. We're forced to save it, but we can actually see where it's going. You know, in a lot of countries, it goes into a kind of a general pool, and you'll be paid a defined benefit contribution versus what we call a defined benefit rather than a defined contribution approach. And that's probably the biggest difference between Australia and the rest of the world, and why I think we're one of the only ones that call it superannuation. Which is a strange concept in itself.
Yeah, we've got a good thing going on.
Yeah. And we're always the envy of the world in terms of our superannuation pool, apparently, which is over, I think it's a couple of trillion now. After only starting in 92. But that's going off topic. Back to, so if there were, say, 2 reasons why superannuation is by far the best, how would you answer? What are the best? What are the 2 reasons why you should sock all your money into super?
The first one is tax. The tax benefits, if superannuation is utilised well, are enormous. And the second reason for mine is flexibility. A lot of people look at superannuation as a fairly inflexible thing.
Money. I can't see that.
But that's not true. And particularly if you a combination of perhaps school yourself on it and understand it better, and or work with a financial advisor who understands it well and can properly utilize the system. There's a huge amount of flexibility in terms of how and when you can fund your retirement and what capacity that you have there. What about for you?
One of the tax is clearly the benefit, and we know no one wants to pay more tax than they have to. But it's significantly better. So if there's 2 phases of superannuation, we'll touch on mainly focus on the first one in this episode, which is accumulation. Accumulation simply means you're still working and putting money into your super fund. Pension is when you start relying on the capital you have, the finite pool of capital, to replace your active income. So what you're talking about is a passive income that replaces your active income. In accumulation, your tax rate is capped at 15%. So income, capital gains tax at 15% with a discount as there is in other entities for assets held for more than 12 months. So if you think 15% compared to the marginal tax rate, your marginal tax rate goes up to 47. If you're holding assets in super versus your own name and you're on the top marginal tax rate, you're saving 30 cents in the dollar on the income that you're producing. And that's why it becomes a no-brainer. And the challenge, of course, is balancing the objective of living a nice lifestyle today and having enough in that tax-effective environment, but locked up until you get to 60. And that's changed in the last 10 years, gone from being able to access at 55 to being able to access at 60. And it wouldn't surprise me if at some point in the next few decades, I won't set a time frame on it, that it's actually
100%.
65 for everyone.
It's not going to sit it. Yeah, especially as the pension age kicks out, which it has already. There's no doubt that, in my mind, that it'll move forward from 60.
And there's a lot of conjecture or confusion around the caps that work within superannuation. There's maybe we'll start with, there's 4. We've got a transfer balance, a total super, a concessional and a non-concessional.
Yep. There could be another.
Yep. So, let's ignore that one. It's too much of a political football, the old $3 million cap at the moment.
I can't see how that's going to fly in current. Yeah. I'll be terrified if it does.
We'll put a recording I'll be recording that on Siri to make sure we remind. So maybe it's worth working through the 2 types of superannuation caps that are in place, because historically, and probably when we started the industry, it was like a free-for-all in superannuation.
Yeah.
With very few contribution caps.
Yeah. Those were the days, hey? Yeah, I remember you could being able to put like $100,000 in and just claim a tax deduction for it. That's a pretty sweet outcome. But the government smartened up to that one pretty fast. So the 2 caps, you might have heard these terms too. Cap number 1 is called a concessional contribution cap, and the second cap is called a non-concessional cap. So pretty easily titled. The concessional cap is one that most of you will already be familiar with, because the money that goes into super, for example, through your employer's contributions, the 11.5% that goes in as part of your and goes toward your concessional contribution cap. Now, you've got a limit at time of recording. That limit is $30,000 a year. And the really significant benefit of this concessional contribution cap is that you're eligible for a tax concession by putting the money in. So again, as we discussed, that includes the money that comes from your employer. If you think about your employer's that payment, let's say your income is $100,000 plus super. Well, actually, your overall income is $111,500 because you've got 11.5% going into super. Yeah. But you don't pay tax on that $11,500 because you are getting a tax deduction for that amount, because it is a concessional contribution. Now, for most people, unless you're absolutely hitting it out of the park, most people will have space in that cap every year to be able to put extra money into super and claim a tax deduction. Yeah. And that's where you were talking before about the advantages of money being in super, like the tax benefits of money being invested in super versus in your own name. But when you overlay that with the fact that there's a tax benefit immediately when you get the money into super in the first place by way of by a tax deduction, that can be super helpful.
And that's a salary sacrifice strategy is what we talk about a lot.
Correct. Or pleasingly, in the last couple of years, we've now got the ability to just drop in a lump sum at any point during the financial year and just claim a tax deduction. So like, for example, for a lot of our members, almost all of them, we'll get to the end of the financial year and we'll work out for all of our members, what caps do you have the ability, like what space in the cap do you have? We might have had someone that's put in 20,000 for the year. We say, well, there's 10,000 more that you can put in. And for simplicity, if that person was making, let's say, $200,000 a year, we say, well, Tom, if you want to put $10,000 into superannuation this year, then when you do your tax return, you're going to get $4,700 back as a tax refund.
Reducing your taxable income.
Pretty good outcome. $10K in, $4,700 back when you do your tax return. So that's their concessional contributions, incredibly beneficial. There is a little disadvantage though, which is that when you put money in as a concessional contribution, it is taxed when it goes into the super fund, and it's taxed at 15%. Right. Yeah. Now there's a couple of rules for higher income earners, but for simplicity, we'll keep it moving. The second cap is what's called a non-concessional contribution, and that's a fair bit easier. The cap is $300,000.
Is where you sock it away.
Yeah, that's yeah. You're socking that all day. Yeah. So the non-concessional contribution cap is $120,000.
Yeah.
Or you can.
And they keep changing.
They're
it's hard to
moving
keep up at the moment.
You can actually do up to $360,000 if you do it in one financial year. It's called the bring forward rule. You can put in, one money for this year and next year and the year after, but the flow on of that is that you're not able to contribute any more non-concessional contributions over the next 2 years.
You get a tax deduction for those ones?
You do not, but that's fair. And the thinking around it is that if the money goes into the super fund, it isn't taxed. So you could have, say, $50,000 and you can put $50,000 into the super fund, bam, and the pure $50,000 goes into the super fund with no tax. And the government's of the view that if you've got money in your own pocket, it's already gone through the tax system. Tax, So therefore, you should be able to, if you put it into super and got taxed, it'd be double counting. Or double taxing rather. So in that scenario, it's just pure. You get to put the money into the superannuation environment. There's no tax associated on the way in, but there's no tax deduction for you available either.
And this is one of the, the two biggest ways to get money. There's a few other contribution strategies we'll talk about, but this is probably where the big question comes when you've got after-tax savings. How much do you put in? We've got limits on the high level of that, and how what are the best places to put it once you're into that environment as well?
Yeah.
I think probably stepping back slightly would be on top of the contribution caps, there's limits in terms of how much you can get into the superannuation environment. They've been increased. I think I was on stage and they were increased the day before and I got that wrong once. That. So this is, and it can be confusing because when most people have read it, it was $1.6 million that you could have in superannuation before you were limited to what further contributions you could make. And that's now 1.9 million, but for added complexity. And that's how much you can have in the superannuation environment. That doesn't give any consideration to whether you're drawing a pension and how much is tax exempt. So probably worth expanding beyond non-concessional and concessional contributions into a few other ways that you can get money into superannuation. Most still rely on not necessarily your non-concessional contribution caps, but there are a few that fall outside that. Mm-hmm. One would be, which we've kind of addressed in the previous episode, is the downsizer. And there's a way that people can extract this equity that's sitting in their homes if they've held them. I think it's now for 10 years. And it used to be you had to be over 65 and it's dropped to 55.
It has, yeah.
But in addition to those $120,000 a year, $360,000 in a bring forward cap, an additional $300,000 per person on the sale of a property. And do you work with your members in other types of contributions like spouse and co-contributions that also have tax benefits?
Yeah, always. Yeah. This is free money as far as I'm concerned.
I love the free money.
The idea, so with a spouse contribution, if essentially it enables you to make a contribution of up to, well, you can put as much as you want in, but the real benefit comes if up to $3,000.
Yep.
You contribute it into your spouse's name and you get an 18% tax offset, which is $540. That's the maximum. So and the key thing about this, is that this is not a deduction. This is an offset. And the difference between the two, a deduction will reduce your taxable income. So helpful, but it's not as beneficial as an offset because an offset is just pure wipes the tax out. So you're saving $540 in tax. Very beneficial. And the co-contribution also is you can put up to $1,000 in and you're getting $500 back from the government if you have a low income in that financial year.
I think the biggest thing here is that the government is incentivizing people to put as much money into superannuation as possible because it reduces the reliance on things like the age pension. And I think most, where you're in a position to, people would like to control their own destiny in their retirement. And that involves, saving money, using your cash flow surplus and trying to self-fund your retirement in the majority of cases. And you've got using the age pension as a backstop or a fallback in the cases that it's unachievable or things happen during your life. I mean, we touched on contributions and the ways to get money into super. It's probably worth diving a bit deeper into the different types of super funds. I think there's a lot of confusion that comes that there's basically three types. There's an industry fund or a profit for member, depending on whether you like that wording or not. There's a retail platform and an SMSF, and they're all incredibly different. And there can be a misconception that they're taxed differently. Do you face that question quite regularly?
Yeah.
And do you have a preference for one over the other? Or maybe we'll go into a bit detail on how they all work?
Let's speak to them, and because I think they all have a great place depending on who you're sitting in front of. The industry fund is one that hopefully most Australians are familiar with. You've certainly had a higher level of we're doing the hand gesture right now. You've certainly had a higher level of exposure to advertising with industry funds than the others. I dare say.
Our colleague.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Chris Tucker.
Oh, cool.
Who came up with the
really?
The hand in hand.
Oh, wow.
Apparently,
Good on him.
A long time ago now. One of many claims to fame.
That's a good claim to fame, though. Yeah. Okay, so the industry super funds, they've really been designed to create a good quality, simple solution for people who are looking to build their retirement assets.
Disengaged.
Yeah, most people, especially younger people with their superannuation, that's going to bubble along in the background, especially while the balance is quite low, it doesn't tend to get a huge amount of focus. And for that reason, an industry super fund is essentially going to ensure that, as a house rule, fees remain pretty low. Granted, your investment options commensurately are likely to be quite a bit lower, and your flexibility is certainly lower in terms of some of the strategic things that you can do. But again, most people in industry funds don't necessarily value that. What they want is simplicity. They want that report, the ease of login to just say whereabouts is my balance today, and they're not necessarily needing advice either, or not feeling that they need advice at that point in time.
I mean, I think the average age, and I'm half making this up, the average age of industry fund members is either in the late 20s or early 30s. There's a lot of default contributions. They're originally created to pool the investments of people in different industries, hence the name, whether it was media, finance, and all different parts of the industry, and they've all consolidated for better or worse into a very small pool of really large super funds. And historically known as being incredibly low fee, they're not necessarily as low fee anymore. And in our experience, they tend to be more very suited to the accumulator. People who are still putting that money away consistently. And you're seeing in legislation at the moment, the Retirement Income Covenant is forcing funds to consider what to do for their retiring members. But like the trend is that the people, as they get close to retirement, tend to roll out of them for one reason or another and go into alternative structures because that communication and that one-on-one isn't necessarily there. But that doesn't mean this is the thing about super. What's right for one person now may not be right for them in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
And there's even a trend where people, as they get even older, end up rolling back to an industry fund because it is that kind of set and forget.
Yeah.
That's the first option.
I'd like to add here, industry funds get a bad name in financial advice a lot of the time. I'm incredibly grateful for industry super funds. I think if you had, and I say that because considering how poor this environment could be, superannuation, if it wasn't well structured, thinking about where we've landed over the last 30 years of superannuation
default money.
Yeah, that's right.
Putting your salary away.
I feel like this has got tighter and tighter and tighter to the point where, for the most part, if you are someone who just wants to let it bubble along in the background, if that's your mindset, it's done pretty well.
It's like you call it, if you say it's the average.
Yeah.
And I pulled out the data from Super Ratings. So the average balance fund, and the balance fund isn't balanced, as you just suggest. Balance, you think it's 50-50. It's more like 75 to 80% growth assets. Long-term returns are 7 years, about 6.7%, and 10 years is 7% for a traditional balance fund. And you think that's pretty consistent after fee return from a baseline option.
Yeah. Now, before we move on, though, it would be remiss of us not to point out here that even if you are that person who's been relatively disengaged with your industry super fund, for example, or your super, where you invest your money, even the limited control that you have available through an industry super fund, you really should give some thought to how your money's allocated there. One of my immense pet hates about our default superannuation system is the idea that younger Australians, and by younger I'm going to say 45 and under.
I'll take that.
You're welcome.
I'll take that.
45 and under, the default solution is that the money's invested in this, basically like an 80-20 allocation, which in essence means that they want to give you as much growth as possible, but they don't want to field 4,000 calls a day when they have a global financial crisis. And just a little bit of education and understanding that a little better. And ideally, if you're comfortable, having the courage to invest your money differently and potentially more aggressively, knowing that, hey, I've got a long time until I retire, the difference in that is hundreds of thousands of dollars for a switch that might take you 10 or 15 minutes, 5 minutes on your computer at home. And so this, for me, I see as just a glaring problem with our system, that young Australians that have, in some cases, 50 years until they retire, get their money put into an allocation which is really designed, in essence, to protect the super fund, to not have those really worried people calling in a market event. Yeah. I think we could be a lot more courageous here and make sure we have better educated investors, and when those events happen, say, here's all the education to help people, and this is why we're doing what we're doing. So certainly how you invest your money in an industry fund does make a lot of difference.
And that's probably a good segue to the other end. I always find it easier to go from an industry fund to an SMSF, like in the story, because they're the absolute opposite spectrums.
They sure are. Yeah.
Industry fund, you're basically fully outsourced. That's the best way I think of it. You're outsourcing everything. One of the common misconceptions is that they provide advice. So the fee that they charge, you're getting very little. If you're getting any advice, it's very specific to their own product. So when you think about when you're comparing fees in different options, you need to consider what you're getting. That's essentially 100% outsourced. You set and forget. You get a statement every 6 months. You can log in if you want. If you want to roll over, you're generally doing it online. It's hard to talk to someone. I tried to call them. I've got a small balance at one of the funds. I tried to call them.
Are you still waiting for a callback?
In the pandemic? And please direct your query to our app. Was where it went. I won't name which fund. I'm sure it was all of them. But then the other end of the spectrum, as the name suggests, SMSF, so self-managed super fund. And the industry has evolved a lot. Like SMSFs were originally there to help, say, business owners, people who own farms and big properties, to be able to own their business as part of their superannuation, or own their property as part of their superannuation and retirement strategy. Lease it to themselves or lease it to other people, and assist in funding their retirement, but assisting small business to grow as well. It's evolved a lot. Basically, Australians love investing, and SMSF is the complete opposite end of the spectrum. They allow you to fully insource every decision. So we find a lot of people come to us because they think the other options lack transparency. They can't see where every dollar is being invested, or similar to yourself, they're not comfortable with the 80-20.
Yeah.
They don't want to pick from 5 options.
Yeah. You certainly lack control, don't you? Yeah.
And people with SMSFs, in our experience, want control, even if that control is coming to someone like yourself or myself and providing them with ideas which they then approve, or at least they have the control and the absolute decision over. And part of that's probably something that's big for you, the way you do business, and that's this ability to have an ethical, sustainable, or other tilt, and avoiding certain investments. Mm-hmm. You find, I know you're very focused on offering sustainable opportunities, or investing more sustainably. And unfortunately, it's not necessarily a broad option in each of the other structures that are available.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and I think as you're talking about control, I mean, just because you can have control about something doesn't mean you should have control over it. Right?
That's what keeps me up at night. When I get asked, it's like the Australians the government allows every Australian, if they wanted to access control every dollar of their retirement savings.
From day one.
That scares me.
Yeah. There are some real benefits strategically that happen from having control, particularly as you move toward retirement. Yep. And without getting too granular about this, a classic example would be that where if you were to hold some assets inside a self-managed superannuation fund, for example, because you control all of them, you might decide, hang on, I'm about to retire. When I retire in a year's time or 6 months' time, I'm going to go from having all my money in accumulation, which is taxed at 15%, as Drew pointed out, to going to pension, where it's taxed at 0%. So I'm not going to sell that asset right now. If I sell it at the moment, I'm going to pay 15% tax. If I wait 6 months, I'm going to pay 0% tax for selling the same asset. So you don't get that level of control, that level of flexibility with an industry fund, because where the money is invested, all of those transactions, those buys and sells are just happening for you. That's the default. It's a beautiful default, and it's what makes it's what makes the whole system work the way that it does. But that's why strategically, particularly as you move toward retirement closer and closer, I think that's probably the reason why a lot of Australians start to move away from industry funds and look at alternatives, is because of the strategic benefit of having control during that phase.
And it's not just control over investments, as you're saying. Like, we tend to focus on the control over investments, and as I went straight into, but control over strategy and structure. So there'll be simple things with an SMSF, and as we talked about, more people are transitioning into retirement. So this ability to actually have an accumulation and a pension account within your SMSF is incredibly powerful, whereas in any of the other options, you'll have to have multiple accounts. And I think an extension of that is the ability to combine or share the costs of an SMSF with a partner or up to 4 family members as well. So probably important to understand that when you combine your superannuation in an SMSF, you still have your own superannuation balance. All the contribution caps are per person. All the balance caps are always per person. And if you were to combine an SMSF, we can talk about the benefits of that. Your own member balance will remain your member balance regardless. You're just pulling it to invest in other assets.
Yeah.
So do you think you find cost as one of the biggest reasons people come to you or consider SMSFs?
No, predominantly it would be control. Yeah. What about for you?
I found it change recently. I know ASIC in the last kind of 10, I think it was about 5 years ago, we talked about the minimum balance that you'd have in superannuation as being much higher. I think they were talking about at least $500 to $1 million to set up an SMSF. And more recently, it's come down to like 250. And that's kind of a reflection of technology. The benefit in our view of SMSFs is when balances get larger, the cost of an SMSF is basically down to preparing a set of financial accounts every year and lodging a tax return. And you can generally get that done for something like $3,500 a year. It's not percentage based, depending on what investments you go into. It's basically, that's the fixed cost. If that's all you want to do, you want to buy some stocks and term deposits in there, that's the base fee you're going to pay.
Yeah. And if you're confirming, if we're comparing that versus, let's say you might have, and this may seem like a high value, but for a retiree, you might have $1 million in superannuation and they're paying a default amount of 0.8%. That's
every dollar that goes in
$8,000 versus
going up every year.
Understood.
That's probably one of the cost benefits that come with it. But we've talked about, so one end of the spectrum, being industry, SMSFs at the other end, platforms.
Now we've got the Goldilocks.
Yeah, just right.
Yeah.
And I talk about it a lot, and the industry has evolved a lot in probably the time we've been in the industry, even before that, platforms sit in the middle. They're generally retail or corporate. They're brands like Hub24, you'd see on the stock exchange, Netwealth, Colonial First State, BT, the list I'm sure goes on. And they're kind of bridging both. So at one side, they allow you some level of control. And at the other side, they allow to outsource a lot of the investment decisions. Have you got a position on platforms?
Yeah, I think they're great. And I know I'm saying that everything's great here. It's not lost on me. I really am pretty happy with the system, but I really like the fact that you can achieve a lot of the outcomes around control. You can control the assets that you purchase. You can say yes and no to things. You can choose when to buy and when to sell things, and it really can become quite bespoke if you want it to. Or it can be something where almost like an industry fund, you can have it set up to say, well, I'm just going to outsource all of the investing decisions to 1 or 2 or 5 different groups and just let that operate. I think this is a really effective, for lack of a better term, halfway house in terms of saying, well, I want more control than I have right now. And
I don't want to deal with all the stuff.
But I don't want to do the tax returns, and I don't want to have that kind of noise.
I think the drawback for some people would be the most platforms require an advisor to be able to use them. But if you think about the structure of each of these, industry funds use the trustee of your superannuation assets, it's probably getting to quite a high level, is the industry fund entity. A platform, it's a massive corporate entity or a large custodian. An SMSF, it's yourself and your partner. So that's kind of the big kind of governance and structural differences that go between the three. And I'm seeing increasing. So, say 5 years ago, the SMSFs, and I think the structure's still there for larger balances, were significantly more attractive than platforms. But in the last 5 years, the reasons to use an SMSF are slowly being negated by the evolution and technology of platforms.
Yes. Yeah, I think I know what we've just gone through is pretty heavy.
I know. This is the problem with two financial advisors talking on a podcast.
We've certainly got the thing that you can take from this really is that there are a tremendous amount of options available in the superannuation system, and that's a good thing. It is wherever you are on this journey. If you're someone who has money in that industry fund, or if you're someone who has money and you've taken total control over it. The key thing is, above all else, having a high degree of confidence that you're on the right track. That can come a lot of ways, but people deserve on this journey to feel like they're on track, and also to be able to identify if they're not. So if you're going through this and thinking to yourself, yes, but what does this all mean for me practically? Which one should I choose and what should I do? As we, in Q&As, et cetera, we'll get more granular about some of these things. But really the most important thing that you should be asking yourself right now is, do I actually feel like I'm on track? Do I feel like my superannuation strategy is conducive of me getting to retirement within the time frame and on my terms?
And a big part of that's engaging. So finding the fund and structure that gives you the most engagement and you feel most comfortable with, because that's the only way you're going to stick to it.
Yeah.
I think to round out this episode, we started with this idea of forging a cash surplus. We delved into one option, and there's probably a few other areas where we think about putting that money.
Yeah. Yep. So let's jump into debt reduction.
Yeah, that's the biggest question. Do I pay off the debt or do I put it into super? And I think everyone's got a different answer on this too.
Yeah, I'd love to get really granular on this at the right time, because I've run the numbers a lot of times, and the numbers almost always are, assuming that you optimally utilize the superannuation system with how you contribute and the timing. My experience is that you're better off putting the money into super. Not financial advice. That's your own situation, et cetera, et cetera.
So the counter would be, by putting it in your mortgage, you're getting an after-tax return, or an after-tax return that's the interest rate plus your tax rate.
Absolutely. Yeah. But even at
You're refuting that.
Even at current tax rates, and I guess it depends on where your money's invested. We also have to consider the fact that when you put the money in, you're getting an immediate tax benefit, assuming that that's available to you via a concessional contribution, like we talked about before. So you get upfront money, which actually enables you to do both.
Yeah.
You could put the money into super, and you use that tax refund, for example, to pay off the mortgage, and you're getting the best of both worlds.
Probably something often forgotten.
Or reload it. Yeah. So no, again, having run it quite a few times, if you're someone with a high mortgage in your 50s and thinking realistically, I'm going to be paying this all the way out until maybe I retire, and then using some of my super, for example, to clear the debt, or pretty close to, I implore you to get some advice on this, because it's considerably better in a lot of cases.
And it's probably a good area to start wrapping up as well, in terms of, when you get to this point that you're starting to make decisions, what assets do you have, and where one, we've talked about debt reduction. A lot of people I meet, jump straight back into property. They've done incredibly well out of owning their property, and it's not always, and this is probably the very good advice, is if you're going into leverage at an important time of your life with cash flow, or buying lumpy assets. So is that is there a decision-making framework you have?
It's always situational. Yeah. We're going to be saying that a lot. I'm sorry to say.
That's why I always say it depends.
Yeah. I agree. It can be a fantastic asset.
Yeah.
The challenge that you have, particularly with a pre-retiree, is, as you've pointed out, it's a lumpy asset. So assuming that you're going to buy it and holding it into retirement, we really at that point have to be thinking about what kind of property we're going to own.
Yeah.
And in particular, the term that we use, what kind of yield is the goal here? Are we looking to buy a property that is going to have a really high return of rent every year?
Yeah.
Because if so, then that's really going to help us when we get to retirement, and we're looking to use all of the income that we can to fund our lifestyle when we leave work. Conversely, we might be looking for a property where the number one focus is growth. And the downside of that is, if you intend to hold that until and beyond you retire, hopefully you'll have paid off all the mortgage or gone on top of the mortgage, but the rent you're receiving might be so small that in your pocket there's actually no financial benefit day to day, week to week for that.
That's something we see as well, which is most people come to us and they're split between property, lifestyle property or not, and superannuation or investable assets is like 2/3 to 1/3. And ultimately our goal is to have 2/3 of your assets, which is by growing those assets in the superannuation, not necessarily just super, but investable assets that you can use to generate income. And I think most advice is going to be based around, how do you get the most into that pool over that 10 years? And the answer for anyone is, whether it's property or investments, is putting your money to work.
Yes.
And making sure you're not setting yourself up for mistakes.
Yeah. Also, just to add to that momentarily, if you were in your 50s and hell-bent on buying a property, you'd found the right property, it's the one for me, you still, there'd be merit in considering doing that through the superannuation system, right?
We can do another episode there.
Yeah, lots to unpack.
Yeah. I think we've gone very deep on this episode. And it's, thanks for everyone for listening to this latest episode of Australian Retirement Podcast. We'll delve more into SMSFs, we'll delve more into properties in future episodes, and we'll start working through some case studies as well. So appreciate you sending any questions you might have through. And if you got one little action point that people should take away from this episode.
I was just about to spike you with that question myself. Definitely. And it loops back to what I was talking about before. Take stock to think about how you feel about your retirement right now and how you feel about your retirement journey. If you are feeling a really high degree of confidence and you feel like you've got the ducks lined up as best you can, brilliant, and play on. But if you're not feeling that way, well, then it's time to start considering taking some action here. Like whether that's advice, whether that's engaging more with your super fund and understanding more where's my money invested and what's happening there, whether it's thinking more constructively about my retirement lifestyle and what I'd like that to be. It's time to start bringing those conversations forward.
And I'd say go register or log into MyGov. A lot of people we talk to still haven't registered for it. So I always start with that. And go check out what's your total super balance. There's super funds that you've forgotten about that are in there. And there's things like how much of your contribution caps have you used in the past. So that'd be the biggest takeaway. And I'd say thanks for joining me again, James.
Pleasure, mate. Cheers.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.